Senator from Oklahoma.
Well, I need to tell Molly that I've reduced the length of my speech from 1 hour to 30 minutes because of something that I totally did not expect. However, I think it's going to have a happy ending. I think the bottom line in all this discussion, the earmarks, or however we want to word it, is that we got to do something about excessive spending. It's something we cannot continue. It's not sustainable. I think everyone agrees with that. You know, it's kind of interesting to me when I see the...
Senator is not in order. Senator from Oklahoma.
It's interesting for me when I see the president and the passage of such things as the 787 stimulus and all of that to say we're going to form a commission to see how we can keep from spending so much money. Well, that's how you do it. You just don't do things like that. Let me say, first of all, after this election, the Tea Party did play a big part in this thing, and I have to say that I was very excited about it early on. I think I might have been the first Republican, anyway, to go to Marco Rubio and support him and his efforts down in Florida and several of the others. And I think it's clearly a good thing, a change. And I think the American people have clearly spoken. Now, in spite of what you might have heard from the media, let me just clear up one thing. Never have I once had any indication of trying to influence anyone from voting for or against a ban on earmarks. Because you'll find out in just a minute how I can come to this conclusion and why it wouldn't really be necessary, and it doesn't make all that much difference. But before I do, let me just kind of to make sure that people understand, you're hearing these comments. Not just from any member of the Senate, but from someone who probably, I'd have to say, has been declared as the most conservative member of this body more times than anybody else has, most recently by the National Journal. And so you're hearing this from someone who is a conservative. And someone who is also lonely. You know, I go back quite a ways, but I can remember my two favorite senators, my mentors, I guess I should say, were Jesse Helms and the senator from Nebraska, Carl Curtis. Now, both of them deceased, and it's been quite some time since Carl Curtis was serving. But nevertheless, I always remember I was in the state senate. This is many years ago, and and I was recognized as a conservative at that time. Carl Curtis was serving here from Nebraska, and he's the guy you might remember, Mr. President, who consistently, year after year after year, introduced the budget balancing amendment to the Constitution. Well, he called me up one day, this is back in the 70s, and he said, Inhofe, I know that you and I share the same philosophy, but I can never get this up for a vote. And the excuse that the liberals use is that you'll never be able to get 3/4 of the states to pass a resolution ratifying the Constitution. So his idea was kind of ingenious. What he said was, I'll go ahead and get started and stand behind you, and we'll find you in enough other states to make up 3/4 of the states, and we will pre-ratify a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. Well, I didn't really understand how it would work, but we talked about it for a while. So I said, well, let me try it. And so I did. In the state Senate, I pre-ratified a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. It was really kind of fun because after that, I started going around to other states and getting them to do the same thing. We got up to within, I think, 4 states of being able to do it before it started to unravel. But a guy named Anthony Harrigan, he was a syndicated columnist from down south someplace. He wrote an editorial, or an op-ed piece that got published, and it was called A Voice in the Wilderness. He said, way out in the state of Oklahoma, there's one state legislator who's going to balance the federal budget. And so that was kind of the beginning of kind of a lonely ride that I've had. Since that time, I remember serving in the House of Representatives. And at that time, John Nance Garner, this is 80 years ago, John Nance Garner was the Speaker of the House. And John Nance Garner devised a system. Here was the problem that he had. People were getting more and more informed on how people are voting in America. And so he had all his West Texas members, and they didn't want to vote for the liberal agenda of the Democratic Party. I mean, can you see anyone from West Texas voting for gun control? It just isn't going to happen. And so he devised a system that's kind of ingenious, corrupt but ingenious, and that was a discharge petition. So that if you, in the House of Representatives, if you want to take up a bill, you have to have it either come out of a committee, or if it's in a committee, you have to have a discharge petition, sign a discharge petition to force it to come out. Now, he wanted his members to be able to say that they signed the discharge petitions, and yet they wouldn't sign them. And so the bills would never come out. And they kept the discharge petitions in a locked drawer, just like you have, Mr. President, right up there in front of the whole House of Representatives. And you couldn't open up the drawer unless you were signing a discharge petition. You couldn't copy down the names of anyone else who has. Well, what I did is set up a system where I had people go up and memorize names, and then I went ahead and disclosed all this. Anyway, it's a much longer story than that, but the bottom line is the punishment for doing what I did was to be expelled from the House of Representatives. Now, I said, oh, okay, that's fine. I'll go ahead and do it anyway, and just let them expel me. That'll create a vacancy. I'll run for the vacancy. And who's not going to elect someone who was expelled because he shed light on the system? And it worked. And it was declared by several publications as the greatest single reform in the history of the House. Again, it was lonely, but it's something that worked. Then along came global warming. And we all remember this. Remember the Kyoto Treaty? Back then, in fact, back during the Clinton-Gore years, when the Kyoto first came up, most people thought this is something that was going to be ratified until they looked at it to see what it would cost if we were to do this. And the cost was somewhere it was always between $300 and $400 billion. And so I looked at that, and we all looked at it, and we thought, do we really want to ratify this convention? Well, as it turned out, we didn't. And one reason we didn't was Senator Byrd was the primary mover in a motion to stop it from happening unless the developing countries had to pay the same price as the developed nations. And, of course, they didn't do it, so it didn't happen. Then they started, several people said, well, let's just do it unilaterally. And we had the McCain-Lieberman Bill of 03 and the McCain-Lieberman Bill of 05. Now, at that time, I was enjoying being a majority. Now, the occupier of the Senate today has never been in the minority, so he may not know what I'm talking about. But in the majority, you can do a lot more things than you can as a minority. So I chaired the committee called the Environment and Public Works Committee. That committee had jurisdiction over all the energy issues and a lot of other things, but also over this global warming thing. I have to confess, I assumed back then, and this is back in about 2002, that the catastrophic global warming was a result of anthropogenic gases or of man-made gases, CO2, methane, and the such. And so I assumed that was the case until the Wharton School came out, and they did a study, and they came to the same conclusion. That if we were to pass, at that time as the McCain-Lieberman bill, that it would end up costing about between $300 and $400 billion. And so my effort then, as chairman of that committee, let's look and see where the science is. And that's when we got the realization that it all started with the United Nations. They had developed the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and consequently they were going to do all this, and that was the science behind it. But we kept getting complaints because I'd make statements on the floor questioning the science. Then scientists started coming in. Well, the bottom line is this. After a period of time took place, up until a year ago right now, it looked as if people recognized that it wouldn't do any good if we did unilaterally pass it. And why is that? Even Lisa Jackson, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, said that if the United States alone passed something to stop the different emissions, CO2 emissions, it wouldn't have any effect globally, because that's just the United States doing it. In fact, you could argue it'd have just the opposite effect, because companies seeking power would have to go to countries where they didn't have these restrictions, and it could actually increase CO2. Anyway, the bottom line was that I made the comment, this has been now 8 years ago, that the idea that catastrophic global warming is a result of man-made gases is probably the greatest single hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. Back then, everybody hated me, and now it looks like we've pretty much won that argument. I only mention this because I am very much concerned. I understand the argument on both sides of the whole thing about the earmarks. And I had put up my number one chart there, will you? Kay and I have 20 kids and grandkids. This little guy right here came up to me, and he said, Popeye, see, Jody, I is for Inhofe, so it's Mama and Popeye, okay? He said, Popeye, why is it you always do things nobody else does? And I said, that's the reason, nobody else does. And so that's kind of a little bit of the background as to why I got into this very difficult issue. And I have to say that it's something that needs to be talked about today, because something is going to happen this week, and I think we can turn this thing into something that is very good. The Tea Party people came in. My concern has been, over the last 2 years and longer than that, all we've heard about is people, quite frankly, demagoguing this whole thing on earmarks, saying earmarks, earmarks, earmarks. And all the time that happened, what happened? We ended up with the president and the majority increasing the debt to $13.4 trillion in America. And that's a larger increase than all presidents from George Washington to George W. Bush combined. And at the same time, giving my 20 kids and grandkids a $3 trillion deficit. So we were trying to look at this thing and say how we can take care of this situation. And the increase of the debt was something that is not sustainable. I think we all understand that. And I was going to try to accomplish two things: to stop the demagoguing and to solve the problem. And today, for that purpose, I have introduced, and it's at the desk right now, Senate Bill 3939, S3939. Now, I grant you that Senator McConnell's announcement changed the way in which I was going to present this. But the bottom line is this: it would be nothing short of criminal to go to all the trouble of electing great new anti-establishment conservatives who only have to cede to President Obama their constitutional power of the purse, which is exactly what would happen, as has been pointed out, with a moratorium on earmarks. I want to read one statement out of Senator McConnell's thing that I think is worth repeating. With Republican leaders in Congress united, the attention now turns to the president. We have said we are willing to give up discretion. Now we'll see how he handles spending decisions. And if the president ends up with total discretion over spending, that's what he would have, we will see even more clearly where his priorities lie. We already saw the administration's priorities in stimulus bill, and that's become synonymous with wasteful spending. True. That borrowed nearly $1 trillion for administration earmarks, like the turtle tunnels and the sidewalk that led to the ditch and all this stuff that we've been hearing about, which I'm going to elaborate on in just a minute. But nonetheless, I think it's important that we have to look at that. Now, why I thought it was wrong, put up chart number 1, was when you describe an area, I think any time you want to eliminate something, you got to define it first. And the problem was there's no definition until the House came along, and this is about, a year ago, and the House Republicans, not the whole House, but the Republicans, said, resolved that the policy of the Republican conference is that no member shall request a congressional earmark, limited tax benefit, or limited tariff benefit, as such terms are used in Clause 9, Rule 21 of the House Rules. Well, if you look up Clause 9, Rule 21, that applies to appropriations. And so what they were saying at that time, they were not going to appropriate anything. But there's one problem with that. Put up chart 2. Chart 2 is Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. Now, that's what we're supposed to be doing here. And I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit because I think it fits in this debate pretty well. Chart 2, the Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, makes it very clear that we in the United States Senate and the House of Representatives are the ones who are supposed to be spending money. Quote, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. All three of the people that were driving this thing, the senators, by the way, that were involved in the earmark thing and giving proper credit or blame, depending how you look at it. The first one went back the furthest was Senator McCain, then Senator Coburn, and then more recently Senator DeMint. And they all embraced the House definition of the earmarks. I have a chart that shows that, but it's not necessary to do it. I think everyone realizes that. Now let's go back to the Constitution. Well, that's it right there. The Constitution restricts spending to only the legislative branch and specifically denies that honor to the President. We take an oath of office to uphold the Constitution. That means we take an oath of office to uphold Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. And it's important that we elaborate on that of the Constitution, because a lot of people, if you get this fixed in your mind, if there's any doubt but what we are supposed to be doing it, and not President Obama or the executive branch, then listen to this. Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, "It's the duty of the President to propose and the privilege of Congress to dispose." James Madison said, "The power over the person, in fact, may be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people for obtaining a redress in every grievance." Now, why is this? He went on to explain, in not just the Federalist Papers, but elsewhere, that the reason that they call them the direct representative. At that time, I guess they didn't have senators, but the direct representatives should do the spending is for two reasons. Number one is that they are the ones who know their own state or colony or province, their own area, better than the President does. And particularly back in those days, but it's also true today. The second reason is that if they don't like the way they're doing it, they can immediately go ahead and vote them out of office. Well, look what happened November 2nd. That's exactly what did happen. So that was Madison. Alexander Hamilton said, "The legislature not only commands the purse, but prescribes the rules by which the duties and rights of every citizen are to be regulated." Now, there's no wiggle room in that. We're supposed to be us. The Supreme Court Justice, I was talking to someone with the Investors Business Daily, and I said, you know, you probably never heard of this guy, Joseph Story, a Supreme Court Justice. And he said to me, I wish I could remember his name because it was kind of interesting. He said, "Oh, no," he said, "I live out here now, but when I lived in Washington, I went to a weekly meeting. It was the Joseph Story fan club or something like that." Well, anyway, in his commentaries on the U.S. Constitution in 1833, he states, this is Justice Joseph Story, "It is highly proper that Congress should possess the power to decide how and when any money should be applied. If it were otherwise, the executive would possess an unbounded power. Congress is made the guardian of the treasury." And I say all of this to make sure that, you know, you impress upon any impartial patriot that the legislative branch, that's us, and only the legislative branch has the power to spend money according to the Constitution. Now, how does a ban on earmarks cede the authority to the President? This is significant, and although Senator McConnell didn't mention it this morning, let me say what he would have said had he had time, I believe. And also, it will show how this can be impacted by S3939. I would tell you, couldn't it be a more appropriate time to introduce this in light of what's happening? President Obama, this is the way it sets up, any president, submits a budget to Congress, which Congress either accepts all or part of, or rejects all or part of. Now, if we reject it, we substitute what the Obama requests are with what we think is better for America. The cost is the same. I've often said that stopping an earmark doesn't save any money, and not many people understand this, but it doesn't, because all we're doing is taking what the President would have spent on an item and changing that expenditure, canceling that, and putting that same money somewhere else. For example, in his military budget, and I knew that, you know, President Obama doesn't feel the same way I feel about the priorities of defending America. That should be our number one priority. I don't think he believes that. But nonetheless, in his budget, he asked for $300 million and something, plus or minus, for a launching system that is a good launching system. It was called a bucket of rockets. And it's one that I would like to have. But when we went to the Armed Services Committee, and keep in mind, these committees, like the Senate Armed Services Committee, are staffed with professionals. A lot of them are former military people. They're scientists, people who really understand how we can best, with limited resources, defend this country. And so We took the $300 million for that system. Instead, we put that same $300 million, canceled the launching system, and put in 6 new F-18 fighters. They're actually FA-18 E and F model fighters. This is what we all decided would be best. But now, if we substitute our appropriation for his budget item, it would be an earmark by any definition. And if we place a moratorium at earmarks, we would have to accept Obama's original request. This is a concern that I have, but it does lead to a happy ending, as you'll find out in a second. Now, therefore, we won't have any additional F-18s, but there's no money saved. In other words, he would be doing what James Madison wanted us to do. So the Senate is taken out of the process and cedes its power to President Obama. And speaking of the systems that we would not have if we had ceded that authority previously, we would not have unmanned aerial vehicles. The Air Force right now currently is operating at least 36 continual combat air patrols in Southwest Asia. That was a congressional earmark. We wouldn't have it. Instead, we'd have whatever that replaced in the president's budget. We would not have improved armor vehicles and add-on armor. That was a congressional earmark. We would not have mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles to save lives, and they have saved lives. Again, that was a congressional earmark. And we would not have had $14.2 million for detection of landmines and detection of suspected bomb makers and IED makers in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that was a congressional earmark. As a matter of fact, it was my congressional earmark. We wouldn't have had that. So we see that the moratorium would not allow us to change anything in the Obama budget. It would allow President Obama to perform our constitutional duties. But in a minute, I'll give you a solution. And meanwhile, we cannot continue to do the big spending. And I think a ban on earmarks has at least focused right on this problem for right now. Get a chart. Okay, so I had mentioned before that there are 2 problems that I had with a ban on earmarks. One of the bans was it cedes to the president our constitutional duties, and the other, it does give some protection to people who are big spenders. Put up chart 4. I was going to say, and yet technically by the definition, this would be true. I was going to say these were the 4 biggest earmarks, the largest earmarks in 2008. Now, they can argue that they're not earmarks. They can argue this wasn't the intent. Nonetheless, by the definition that I just showed you in the House and the Senate, these were earmarks. And so let's look at what they are. First was the TARP thing. I was one of them who opposed that. $700 billion we gave to an unelected bureaucrat with no oversight whatsoever. The mortgage bailout, $300 billion. The Pelosi-Bush stimulus, that was $150 billion. PEPFAR, that was a program that does some good, but not expanded to the point that it is right now in sending money to foreign countries to fight AIDS. But if you total all that up, that's $1.2 trillion. Now, I'm not as smart as a lot of the guys in this chamber. And so when I see the billions, the millions, the trillions, my head starts to spin, and I'm not sure just how this really affects us. Put chart 5 up. So what I've developed in Oklahoma, no one around here is aware of this, but they are in Oklahoma, is the Inhofe factor. What I do is take this, and I'll use 2009. In 2009, $2 trillion in taxes was paid by individuals across the country. $18 billion came from Oklahomans, which is about 1%, which is normally about right. The average Oklahoma individual tax return for that year, and that was 2009, was $11,100. Now, therefore, the average Oklahoma taxpayer's responsible for providing, and I have the percentage down here of the total federal revenue. So, for every $10 million in spending here in Washington, Oklahomans pay a nickel in terms of how much each family. Now, I'm taking every family in Oklahoma that files a tax return. That's what it amounts.